Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of the Seriously? Podcast. My name's Jake. Here, as always, with me is my fantastic co-host, Jolie. This week, we had a couple topics we could have picked from, but I think the most corporate relevant or world relevant topic right now is DEI programs.
Timely.
Timely is the word. There you go. See, that's why she's far up in the ladder and I'm, it's those types of terminologies that a fourth grader knows. But so that's what we're talking about today. I have some questions I want to get into eventually, but could you start by giving us kind of insight to what DEI programs are and their purpose, at least from your side?
Well, excuse me, DEI is a relatively newer term. Back in the mid-'60s, we had the civil rights movement. Now, that was before I was born. I'm not quite that old. But President Johnson signed into effect an executive order that essentially said that in the government, and then it has spilled over into private sector as well, that protected groups, which are under Title VII, which are those groups that we think about, race, gender, nationality, religion, fill in the blank, color is one of those, that those individuals have had an adverse impact on them because they are part of a protected group. And so throughout my career, really beginning in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, a lot of initiatives came up through the corporate environment that set up, whether they're called affinity groups or they might be called advocacy groups or employee resource groups, and they were really designed to bring people of similar protective class together. So you may have one for veterans, you may have one for Hispanics, you may have one for Blacks, you may have one for women. And in the earlier part of my career, the purpose of those, although if you talk about affirmative action, all employers who have government contracts had to do something called affirmative action. And then all employers had to file a report called the EEO-1 report, which basically says, this is the demographics of our workforce. And if that demographic didn't seem represented to what's in the general public, in an affirmative action plan, you had to put in place actions or remediations that you were going to do to try to change the demographic of your workforce. I will say that, from the time I first started in HR in the late 80s, we did affirmative action plans where we looked at our demographics, we ran our numbers, we filled out our EEO-1 reports. But I don't know, because I've never been in the government, that we had quotas. I was never part of quotas. And as I grew into be a leader, I never had quotas. Certainly, I would say from the time I became, let's say, a VP or maybe even an executive director, I was much more engaged in activities around these affinity groups or these resource groups to say, how do we help individuals that have been underrepresented? And maybe the first time that anyone from their family has been in a professional environment, how do we help them represent well? How do we help them come together? How do we sponsor them and support them at a level that they deserve? So that's really, let's say, from a contemporary perspective, where DEI has come from. So DEI, for anybody who isn't clear, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's really what it's been about. So as an HR professional on my side, I want to minimize any unconscious bias, because just from psychology alone, I or you are more likely to pick somebody like us. It's just an unconscious bias that we have. So for me, I, from an unconscious bias perspective, might be more interested in female professionals. You might be more interested in more creatives, let's just say. Maybe a demographic doesn't play out, but you'll tend to have a bias to select someone in an interview or a promotion process based on something that is like yourself. And so if we think about the one unprotected group, which is white male, they have dominated the workforce. And if I think back to my real introduction to being responsible for DEI work, it started in engineering. And the majority of engineers were male, and the majority of engineers were white male. Doesn't mean they were all white male, and it doesn't mean that they discriminated against people who weren't white males, but that had been a dominated profession from the early part of the 1900s clear through. And so you had this natural propensity of like to attract like. And so you had, the Society of Women Engineers really kind of coming into force and having some political clout, having activities and things around, finding women to be into STEM-like programs. And I don't think anyone from a intellectual perspective would say that was wrong or bad. I remember my son, when he was little, we put him in lots of STEM programs in the summer. He liked math, he liked engineering and order, and so, the majority of those programs were other little boys. I'm not saying there weren't girls sometimes, but they were mostly little boys. My daughter did not have that interest. We never put her in a STEM program, not because she was a girl, but because she had other interests. She was interested in horseback riding. She was interested in softball. And so those were the things that we put her in. And so I give that as a context and a background to say that could have been an unconscious bias on my part and my husband's part, even though we didn't realize it. And so DEI initiatives were designed to level the playing field and try to ensure that everybody, regardless of what they look like or where they come from or what experience they've had in their collective history, they have the same opportunity going forward. And I think that's really what DEI has been about from a contemporary perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that on government contracts, there aren't some thresholds and some requirements. Mm-hmm. And there were. You had to have a certain number of this and a certain number of that. And that all pulled through on your affirmative action plan. And you talked about the different things you were going to do. And certainly if you were bidding for government work, if you were making defense programs or airplanes or bombs or buildings or whatever you made for the government, there were requirements from a DEI perspective. And that really dated back to Lyndon Johnson in the White House, and he signed a series of executive orders. Over the Obama administration and then the Biden administration, that did expand quite a bit. And so you haven't asked me this yet, so I'll wait for your question, but certainly this is mid-February of 2025. January of 2023, with Trump coming back into the White House, there has been a rash of executive orders.
Well, and I'll stop you because this is where this gets interesting, because I'm not coming for this episode. I'm not going to come with my corporate perspective. I don't really have one, right? So here's what I think I can bring to this conversation is I think the term DEI, or what is that called, an abbreviation? There's a word for it, but acronym, thank you, is a vastly misunderstood one. Because I know people who range from thinking DEI is just a way to, like you said, cut out bias or cut through bias. And that's the goal of DEI, where in some cases that's true, some cases it, like you said, has quotas, right? But there's a lot of people I know who think like that. But I also know people on the very opposite end where they look at DEI programs as, to put it in as layman professional terms as possible, anti-discrimination discrimination. because I know people who I went to with in college and people like that who looked at it much like as, well, we don't get that benefit. Why does everyone else get that benefit? And I think there is a point being made there, but I think what's interesting is how the term has evolved beyond what you've just described. Because especially now, I think the big one is LGBT rights and stuff like sexuality, gender. I think that's the big one, especially with this new administration, where even the administration doesn't know where DEI starts and DEI ends. Because when they put out all these executive orders, they're like, okay, removing the quotas, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, all right, cool. But there's even one saying, like, you can no longer teach critical race theory. And it's like, what does that have to do with the DEI whatsoever? Just because they both have race attached? Like,
It's so interesting because the executive orders that Trump has signed, and things are constantly changing. So if you listen to this in another couple of weeks, there'll be more.
It is the, 17th, 16th? So
16th.
it could change within the next 5 days.
Or tomorrow, for all we know.
Yeah.
But I have, I'm not an expert, but I am fortunate enough because of my level that I get to go to a lot of seminars. I get to be part of calls and briefings and ask my questions of, what would be arguably the best attorneys in the space of DEI across the country. And so I really have spent a lot of time in the last few weeks educating myself to understand what do I need to do differently. And so it's interesting that you bring this up, LGBTQ, because I know this is something that you're very passionate about. That was only added to Title VII by the Obama administration. Before that, it wasn't there. I think more contemporary organizations like the ones that I worked for, certainly we felt that at the time we called it sexual orientation. I don't think we would call it that anymore, but we did at the time.
Well, there's multiple, because there's sexual orientation, then gender. They're
Yes.
two different things, but yeah.
But gender was added as well by Obama. But, I believe that from an HR perspective, we believe we don't want to discriminate for anything. Mm-hmm. We want everybody to have the same opportunity. If they're qualified, they're capable, and they are eager to do the job, we want to give those people, regardless of what they look like, me, you, whoever's applied, we want everybody to have a level playing ground. But you're right. I think with this somewhat overreaching series of executive orders, it truly is deeply reaching beyond the government. And a lot of the prior activities did reach into the private sector, but this seems to be completely changing everything. And so
it's like, sorry, go ahead.
Well, what you have is you have organizations that are kind of between a rock and a hard place, and you have a president who is taking more executive freedom than any other president has. Mm-hmm. And you have courts saying, well, he can do this, but he can't do that. And it's an interesting time because we have three arms of government and they're all equal. And yet I think we're going to have to see how this all plays out, whether it's the executive or the judicial or their legislative arm. And I think for DEI, if you read the summaries, if you actually read the executive order and a lot of the discussions that I've had, because I had a very emotive response to this. And my emotive response was really based on the fact that, one, my entire career, I have had some type of DEI that has been ingrained in me as critical, important, and level. But the executive order itself is written very thoughtfully to do exactly what you said initially. It basically says we want to get away from any group getting differential treatment. Yeah. And DEI, that pendulum, because pendulums swing in society, and you're way right and then you're way left, and you hope you want to settle somewhere in the middle. Well, we've swung. We had swung pretty far over. Some of the things that had come through in the Biden administration, I knew about, of course, because it's my space, I pay attention. but it was much more overarching than I think I understood, but it was done quietly under the radar. And so I think for me in particular, and probably a lot of corporate HR people like me, we said, yeah, there's some changes there, but they're not significant. I think maybe they were more significant than I understood. And now that the pendulum has swung back so far, the intent is that there are no DEI programs that should give anybody a leg up. And so everything is based on merit and hard work and drive, which I think fundamentally no one should disagree with that. Everything that I've said up to this point is that I want everybody to have the same opportunities.
Yeah.
But this is saying all of those special niche groups, and I saw a lot of them when I was at the big multinationals. There were women affinity groups and Hispanic affinity groups, and trying to be objective but honest, they did get opportunities that people that weren't in that group did not get. Now, we never told somebody who wasn't Hispanic or wasn't Black or wasn't a woman that you couldn't participate in those activities. But by the very nature of what the club was based on, it probably was off-putting for certain groups to join. And I can remember I was a co-leader for a women's affinity group a couple of companies ago. We employed about 200,000 people internationally. And our chairman was, so I was a co, but our chairman was male. We did that deliberately because we were trying to show anyone can be part of these groups.
Yeah.
And we didn't want a woman over the women's affinity group. We didn't want a Hispanic over the Hispanic affinities group. We had a Muslim group. We wanted non-Muslims in that group as well. Now, we let them form their own groups, but, there was some pressure if you were Black and you wanted to have the opportunity to have access to leaders to join that affinity group. I'm not so naive as to say there wasn't some implied pressure for people to do that. Just like, a white guy going to that might have felt uncomfortable and might have thought, gee, I don't know that I belong. And so if you think about the rescinding of those older executive orders and the new executive orders, on the surface, it seems very fair. It feels like it's taking everything back, to some level state. But it's such a drastic shift. It would be like taking a child from learning division and putting them in a calculus class. It's just so huge, that pendulum, that it is confusing. And I think that you have organizations, and I'm lucky that I'm at a smaller organization and I get to kind of say, okay, anything that I had that I didn't have affinity groups. I'm just too small. I didn't have that. We talked about putting them together. But for me, it's relatively, the change is going to be small. There's a little bit of wordage that I have in certain things. And my company has a lot of government contracts. And I'll revise that to make sure that I don't have anything that references what is now being called illegal DEI activity. But, there are much larger organizations. It's going to be harder for them to change that quickly. Or, my daughter just told me the other day, we have to boycott a major big box store because they've come out and changed all of their DEI initiatives. And I said, it's hard for me. First of all, I can't avoid this store. I buy most of my stuff at this particular store. I went there today. You know what? That's the place that you need to buy toilet paper or fabric softener. That's where you go to get those types of things. But I'm empathetic towards them because they're trying to figure out how not to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that means they're just going to do rampant discrimination against particular groups. But I can certainly see, particularly in your generation, especially when you pull in the gender stuff, which I don't even really completely understand some of it. I got enraged when we had the air crash and the helicopter
The airplane helicopter collision in
Thank
BBC.
you. I'm saying it wrong because some crazy statement came out saying, well, that's DEI.
It was
and you're like,
DEI's fault, guys.
What are you talking about? Who says something like that?
Well, guys, you do know, like, philosophy determines whether we land on the moon, you know, like, because that's the amount of connection we're making here.
It felt insulting and uninformed. Now, I don't want to say that I know everything that happens behind the scenes on these things. I certainly don't. And I certainly don't want to be on a watch list or something because I have a different opinion. But I think it's those types of sensational messages, whether you agree with them or not. I'm not here to debate what anybody believes, but it makes it hard to embrace this new reality that we're kind of finding ourselves in. And I don't quite know that I understand why this huge distinction with gender. Because I mean, if you want to talk about biological gender, fine. There are two biological genders, but it feels like we've moved past that.
Well, and so I'll come in briefly because I don't want this episode to be, well, maybe it can be a brief introduction to some people about gender, but I've studied it, right? What's so interesting is the way words are misused, because what you just said, right? Two biological genders. That's not what gender means.
Okay.
Everyone uses gender like that. That would be two biological sexes. Certainly you can say, like, there's so many, or I'm not even getting into it. I could make a whole podcast episode on gender if I wanted to. But I just wanted to discuss that because the fact we call it gender, even on a macro scale, is so weird, and why we target specifically gender when what's clearly being talked about is sex, not gender. You know, I sit here and I read these things and I'm just like, clearly the mass majority of the public, which happens, right? I'm not going to think everyone does research and stuff, but like, that would be like if you called, that's like if you would call tea coffee. It doesn't make any sense. Like, okay, sure, they're made with hot water. That's about all that's similar.
It's so interesting that you say that because I'm sitting here thinking when I was even your age and a little bit older, when you were filling out any kind of an application or anything, it asked you for your sex.
Yes.
It did not ask you for your gender. It asked you for your sex. I don't know at what point in time I started using gender. I don't know. Probably 2000 plus-ish, so 20 some years, which probably seems like a long time for some of your listeners, but really is not that long in the bigger scheme of things. But it just seems so interesting that it is such a hot topic that we have this much legislation coming out on it. Because I look at it, I have a lot of people in my HR organization that have said they're very nervous, they're very worried. I've had people come up from, different parts of the business and say, what does this mean? Because they feel like whether they, whatever protected group that they're part of, whatever diversity group they exist in, they worry that somehow their rights are going to be eroded. And so, I say, look, the EEOC is not changing. We just have to remove things that are around DEI. But those protected classes continue to stay protected. I suppose if you're not going to enforce it, it's another issue. And just on Friday, I sat in on another seminar where this was the first time I had heard this, and maybe I hadn't been paying attention, or maybe it's new because it's constantly changing. But all forms of government, all offices of government are now being expected to enforce these new illegal DEI activities, which many of these parts of government have never been involved in that before. You really had the EEOC and you had like some affirmative action and maybe some DOL type of stuff, but like Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and you say, well, how could they even be educated in that space? It's like asking your dentist to perform heart surgery. It's two totally different things, to your point, coffee and tea.
Yeah.
But it's just a strange time. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. So I don't know if the listeners or the viewers will take any comfort in this, but what I have said to the people in my company is, you have ethical leaders. You have leaders that believe, and I have to strike saying this in my professional life, but I always say, I want diverse slates, because a diverse slate of candidates, whether it's to hire or to promote, means that I will have diversity in thought and experience. Diversity is more than just the protected class. I want individuals that have been at big companies and small companies. They've been in sales and maybe they've been in operations. And so all of their experiences create someone who has the ability to think on many levels. I can no longer require diversity of slate. I understand that from the training, but I will still push to say I want people from many different backgrounds to compete, because I always want to select the best person. I don't care what they look like. I don't care where they've come from. I really want to always select the best person. And even, I've been in lots of companies, as we talked about before, and I've been in some where maybe the leaders were not as evolved as that. But I do believe where we are in 2025, the majority of leaders want the best person. And they don't care what they look like. They don't care what gender they identify as. They just want someone who's going to come to work and work hard and do a good job. And I do realize that we've all had situations, and not everybody is, again, that evolved. But I'd like to believe that regardless of these shifts and these swings, that's not going to change. And I have a lot of individuals from one particular demographic, and I say, you can't let these things weigh on your consciousness. Your life day to day is not going to change. But use your voice, advocate for yourself, talk to your representatives, come up in corporate setting and talk to HR when you have concerns. I'm not a counselor, but I am a counselor. I have a background in that, but I'm not professionally counseling at work. But HR will listen, and hopefully we can help people realize that there's no reason to overreact. It's easy to say when you have a job and you're comfortable in your job. I worry about, as many of your listeners are, individuals entering the workforce, because they haven't had that experience yet to compete and be selected and know it doesn't matter. But, this is a changing world. I'd like to think that this pendulum that swung so far is going to equalize, but I think we've got 3 to 4 years of this at least.
Well, and I want to go into something there as well, because I think something that makes these things being passed as scary sounding to some people as they are. Because like you said, I would assume at least a good majority of my viewers being closer to my age range, right? Because they're all thinking, because I know multiple people from like my writing department at college who were like, who posted on their stories and shared on their social medias, because that's what we do, about this is ridiculous. They're gonna basically have excuses to fire us and yada, 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 yada. So I think what's interesting is, I like explaining it like this, because I had a conversation with someone who was in a position like that, and they were very in a position at a company who historically isn't that great to their group of people, at least according to the legal documents. But here's how I looked at it, right? It's like, no matter what generation you are, no matter what, I look at it like this, right? It's like, okay, you work at company A, right? A majority of the people who work at company A like the color red. There's a company B. Majority of the people who work at company B like the color blue. There's a company C, and a majority of the people at company C like either red or blue. Now, think about it. Which of these has the most knowledge of these three companies? Simply put, company C. you have the most people with the most differentiation, because you would then be able to, for example, if all these people like these colors, the group at Company A may make products that are only red because, they like the color red. Where at Company B, they make products that are only blue. Company C, you make both. Yes. That's a very oversimplified version.
But it's a great example
of what this is, right? So and like when DEI was introduced, the idea, at least from the research I've done into the original implementations of it, I believe part of the goal was to make more Company Cs.
Yes, it
is.
At
the end of the day.
Yes, that's what DEI is all about.
Because and I think that breaking it down like that may help some of our listeners understand that is the goal here, right? And when you flip it back and remove it, unfortunately, what will come back is, like you said, the bias. Now, people at Company A don't want to hire people that like the color blue because we think the color blue is an abomination. Why? Who cares?
Well, I'm not saying that could never happen. Of course it could happen. But I don't think it's going to happen overnight. They're not going to...
No.
Most companies that are profitable are not going to go out of their way to get rid of people in Company A who like blue. They may not hire more people who like blue, but to actually out and out terminate people, that doesn't really make sense.
Yes, I agree. But that's the fear. So I say that because that unfortunately is a fear by more recent generations because of how many DEI programs had seeped into schools and changed the teaching and education curriculum to teach us more about critical race theory, gender theory, and things like that, where we see these historical things of like African American people being not able to get certain jobs ever because of racism and systemic oppression. So they come to that conclusion.
And I think it's really hard. I mean, many of us are going to be part of one of those groups.
Yeah.
Some of us will be part of a couple of those groups. But it's so interesting because I hear people who have the opinion, and I'm not saying I'm not in this camp, but to say, I believe that most companies will hire the best qualified person.
Yeah.
But, like the example I gave with engineering, sometimes it's hard to become the best qualified person because you don't have that initial opportunity, where somebody else maybe did because they have friends or professors or parents, family, who's helped them get an internship or helped them get their first job. Or they've been in programs that just traditionally pump out really great engineers, and those programs have been typically white male oriented. And I do think from a college perspective, it's even more interesting because they've really tried to balance their representation. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that these new executive orders say is that's illegal. You can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. Well, I have one child getting ready to go to college. I have one that's exiting college or is done with college. And the one that's done with college didn't go to an overly diverse school because they went to a private Eastern elite college. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they probably just by nature, I'm not saying there was no diversity, but it's going to be from a particular subclass. My youngest child wants to go to a big public school. And by nature, those are probably going to be much more diverse because they've had more of a level playing ground with scholarships, controlled tuition, more in-state programs, and then therefore an access of more groups to go to those schools. And it's good that my youngest wants to do that because my youngest wants to be a human rights attorney. And you want to go to a diverse school to be a human rights attorney.
Yes, 100%.
Because you want to understand what it means. But most of us will never understand how prevalent discrimination is. Yeah. I'm a woman, and I will say I have experienced it many times in my career. It's even as simple as sitting in a room, and I'm always the only woman, it seems like, in a board meeting or in senior conferences, and one of the guys, now I'm using this term, one of the men dropped the F-bomb, and they immediately look at me and apologize. That's discrimination.
Yeah.
That makes me feel uncomfortable. Now I've lived with it so long now, I just let it go. I'm always like, whatever. But it is either say it or don't say it. But to assume or to imply that somehow I am more offended than anybody else in the room because I'm a woman, which is what you're saying, is discrimination. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a guy, they think they're just being really polite. They're not, right? And so if I'm black or I'm Hispanic, I am sure there are things that innately I feel are discriminatory that no one who isn't in that same group will. Mm-hmm. And so, I hear, gosh, racism is so, it's so much more prevalent than any of us know. I'm sure it is. But I don't know that quotas fix that. If it was there before, it's going to be there after. What you can't do, I don't think, is worry constantly about it. Work hard, put your best foot forward, educate yourself, because no one can ever take away your education. And when push comes and shove, your education and your experience are always what sets you apart. But it's an interesting time, and I do understand why younger viewers and listeners are nervous about this. I'm nervous about it, and I've been doing this for a long time. I mean, I'm not that far from retirement. But I listen to these things, and I think, okay, I can see the reasonableness of saying that this has given some groups unfair advantage. I don't think I can argue that. Intellectually, that's probably true. I have a white son, and I'd like to think that he was never I'm using air quotes for anybody who's on the radio because I don't know that I believe in reverse discrimination. I believe in discrimination. And you can discriminate against a white male just as easily as you can discriminate against a Hispanic or an Asian female, right? It's just as prevalent or just as possible. But it is something that I think is going to just evolve, and maybe we do another one of these in 6 months. The best and most, I think, comforting thought I can give to this younger organization is, this is freaky for all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think we're all trying to figure out what does it mean. But don't assume that people in leadership are going to go out of their way to discriminate against groups. Yeah. The vast majority of us that are in those roles today grew up with this. And we grew up seeing what came out of the civil rights movement. I wasn't born in the 60s. I wasn't born until the 70s, so I'm not that old. But, certainly I had older sisters who told me a lot about their struggles when they were working. My oldest sisters couldn't even get their own bank account. Mm-hmm. Either their father or their husband in the 70s had to sign them up for a bank account. Yeah. I mean, that's unheard of today. But there's no reason to think we're going to flip right back to that, right? I mean, I'd like to think that we've all evolved. And as a woman, I do think to myself, well, does this mean that, at some point in time, I'm not going to be able to own property? And certainly if you read through Proposition 2025, there's some strange things in that.
Project 2025?
Thank you, Project 2025.
Yeah, that book of 9,000 or whatever.
There's some strange things there. And I think all of us in college read The Handmaid's Tale, right? And then there's been a big TV, one of the cable things did something on it. And when things like this happen, you think, well, maybe that's not too far off. But sometimes I like to borrow that chapter out of Steven Spielberg's story of, I would imagine these horrific things because if I could imagine them, I felt like they could never happen. And I'd like to think that as a species, we have evolved past a lot of this stuff. I think this will slow our evolution, but I don't think it'll derail it altogether because I do think that leaders in most ethical organizations, even the ones that are coming in and saying, fine, we'll take that out of our diversity statements, I don't think that they're going to go out of their way to change who they are. Mm. They're successful because of what they've been doing. You don't want to stop that.
Well, and I want to point out, and hopefully this still rings true. I haven't checked since I've heard, but there is one major warehouse company, I'm not going to say who, but I remember when all this stuff came out, they came out and they're like, nah, we're just going to keep it as we do it and take whatever the L is for that, right? And I always looked at that because I remember when, and I think this is just a true fact of any situation anywhere, when the election was happening and stuff like that, and all these things were promised now that they're pushing forward in this new administration, I knew many people who were terrified, right, that this was even a possibility, and now we're living in it. But I always want to point out that most people, unfortunately, at least I think this is human nature, will adapt to the least difficult road to get something, which is why you see a lot of companies just follow suit and go, yep, we're going to do it just because we're told to.
Well,
right?
And most of us don't want to break the law. It is now a law. And so you're like, well, how do I not break the law but not lose sight of who I am?
Yes. And I think unfortunately, a lot of the big companies we see the names of, right? Whether they're stores or food places or whatever, will just do the safest route possible, which takes the least work, right? Whether that means just implementing it or removing or whatever it is, whatever takes the least effort they will do. But companies like that warehouse store will still exist where they're like, we don't care. We will find our way around this and do it in our own way. And I wanted to say that, especially for the younger listeners, that those are still things, right? We've always seen the opposite. Like every time you're looking around, you can find out what place is anti this, anti that, whether it's up front or hidden in the background, you know? But again, for every one of those, there's going to be one of the opposites, you know? It's just typically the people who are doing the good stuff don't brag about it like the people doing the bad stuff. So we don't hear about it, but that's something of note.
I've had a couple of calls in the last few weeks with fellow CHROs, so other chief human resource officers. And I think it's probably about a 50-50 mix. But, you know, one of the things that I have said within my company to my leadership, to my HR people, and that I've shared with my fellow CHROs is I have been filling out so many of these reports my entire 35 plus year career. I may not need to fill some of those out anymore. I understand that. But I don't know when this pendulum is going to come back. And so what I've done is say, regardless of whether or not I'm required to do something, I'm going to gather all of the data I needed to gather every year prior. I'm going to, I say quarantine it, but I'm going to sit it someplace.
Put it in a safe box.
And so here will be my 2025 data. I may not go forward and fill out all the stuff, but I will have it sitting there. And then I'll do 26 and I'll do 27 and I'll do however long it is I work. Because it is in my opinion, it is a very realistic expectation that this pendulum is going to swing back and someone's going to show up and say, we want to see all that data from those years. And I don't want to create a problem for myself or a problem for whoever follows me of not having that data. And I am always interested in looking at that data. Maybe because I've been conditioned to look at that data. But we're getting ready to kind of think through our 25 reports now, and I will probably still go through all the steps. I'm not going to change anything that I've been doing, but I think that from my perspective, it's still really important to hire individuals that look like the communities that we live and work in. So if I've got mostly women, I want to make sure that I look like that population. That's not normally the case. It's about a 50-50 split when it comes to sex, not gender. But, you know, I think that's just good business. Now, again, I've never had quotas at the company I'm at today. We're too small. Bigger companies, I had quotas, and I get why they're going to go away from that because that's now illegal. And as an HR person, you're not going to do anything that's going to put your CEO in prison, right? And theoretically, he's the guy who's signing off on that. Just like if you falsify OSHA, which is safety stuff, it's your CEO who goes to prison for that. No CHRO is going to do something that's going to put their CEO at risk because Our job is to protect them and do everything that's legal. But it doesn't mean that we can't continue to ensure that we have diversity of thought and experience and all other types of diversity as well.
I think that was a great conversation. We've blasted through this episode, but I think we are hedging on the edge of the corporate world and on the verge of jumping into philosophical gender study. So we'll probably stop.
And this is an emotive topic.
Oh,
really
I think
is.
so. I think this is one of those, like, it's purely belief thing, belief to a certain extent, where how you think, who you are, is going to vastly differ on how you feel on this, based on, realistically, whether people want to admit it or not, their background, how they grew up, who they are now. Those things will all affect your opinion on this, right? So no matter what position you're in, I think everything we mentioned today is still very important to understand, right? Because they are things that I think are vastly impactful in the corporate world, but also just our society.
They are, because this is, like I said, one of the most wide-reaching executive orders and changes in how we've been thinking for generations. And so the enforcement of it will be interesting to see.
We'll see. Well, that'll be the end of this episode, everybody. Episode 4, week late. You can blame sickness. It happened. We almost canceled this thing to a power outage. So, hey, what can you do? But that'll be all for this week. We'll see you all next week. We'll figure out what we cover then. I think we're covering resumes. But we'll see you all then.